Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Race Talks, a webinar hosted by the La Jolla Historical Society. I'm Heath Fox, Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome all of you who have joined us for this program. I'd also like to welcome tonight's guest speakers, James Debello and Earl W Edwards. Jim Debello was born in San Diego. He earned a BA and an MBA from Harvard University and continued his graduate education at the University of Singapore. Jim's career experience includes work as a technology entrepreneur and business executive, and most recently as a candidate for California's 52nd Congressional District. Earl Edwards is the Director of Athletics at the University of California, San Diego, a 23-sport program. Under his leadership over 2 decades, the university has risen from NCAA Division III to Division I. An Alabama native, Earl earned a bachelor's degree in physical education at East Stroudsburg University and a master's degree in sports administration at the University of Massachusetts. He currently serves as chair of the Big West Conference Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage audience members to ask questions during the program using the chat box or the Q&A window located on your lower control bar. I also want to introduce Meg Davis, who is managing the webinar and monitoring audience comments. And I should also note that this webinar is being recorded. We'd like to start by offering Jim and Earl a chance to discuss their experiences and perspectives related to talking about race. Jim, we'll start with you, and perhaps you could touch on this conversation that you and Earl have been having over the past several months.
Well, thank you, Heath, and thank you to the La Jolla Historical Society for hosting this evening. Earl is really the star of the show tonight, but I'm a contributing actor in this discussion. I'm a lifelong San Diegan, as Heath has mentioned. I recently ran for Congress, but this is not about politics. This is about our collective shock at recent events and racial injustice that still exists in America. And as a white man, I reached out to Earl as a black man and said, Earl, I've known you in sporting capacity, and I've had black teammates, but I've never engaged in a conversation about race. And I think it's about time. Would you be willing? And he welcomed me, and we had open conversations, productive in the exchange of ideas. And so the purpose and the objective of this evening isn't to come to any conclusions, offer any solutions per se, but to engage in the objective of having a conversation from a white person with a black person. And I grew up in the era of color blindness. We thought that was the proper approach, not mentioning color when you sat across a table from a black man or a black woman, not acknowledging their race for fear of being considered racist. Well, the table has turned, and it's now considered, and I think appropriate, that we have a conversation and a dialogue to overcome the obstacles that we face in America about racial bias, prejudice, and social injustice. And that really is the purpose of this evening, is to have an hour together via Zoom, unfortunately, but to have a chance to have a conversation openly, frankly, and also to encourage you in the audience and us always to take this action as a public service individually. And it really is. You don't need to be elected to office for public service. You can do it individually. And I know since you're on this call or you're watching this on YouTube, that you care deeply. And you wouldn't be here otherwise. And I care deeply. Earl cares deeply. But for the first time, we've been able to unleash this conversation where before we were uncomfortable. In fact, I've been influenced by a couple of books, one of which Earl has recommended, Race Talk. He'll address that a little bit later. And another that just came out, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, by Emmanuel Acho, a former NFL player, University of Texas alumnus. And he talks about the issues of being a black man in a white society. And again, I think the purpose is really not to point the finger, not to feel uncomfortable necessarily, although sometimes you do, and I did feel uncomfortable in reaching out and opening up a conversation about a black man and a white man having an open dialogue. Interesting, I went to school at Harvard. One of my classmates and one of my teammates is a CEO of Citibank, Michael Corbat. And Michael recently wrote that he said, hey, I think I got it wrong. We've been talking about colored blindness, and yet my CFO, who is a black man, Mark Mason, at the point of George Floyd's death, wrote a very telling, very open letter unleashing his innermost feelings that he's been withholding from within. And it affected Michael, saying, I've played golf with this man, Mark. I'm a friend with him, but we never talked about him being a black man. And Earl, also in his personal experiences, I thought was very telling. He said, when I move into a neighborhood, and it often is a white neighborhood, I knock on the doors to introduce myself because who's this black man walking around our neighborhood? And will they call the police? This is not conscionable today. And so the events of the summer, George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor, the list is too long, really unleashed, I think, a chance to say, you know what, I'm going to speak out. And Earl did. And together we're partnering to have these kind of conversations and encourage what I would call micro conversations that we all can have as a public service. And so I'm excited to be here tonight to really be part of the dialogue and to speak with Earl and open it up for questions and answers that we can provide any insights that we have. One last thing is, we both see this from the lens of sportsmen. Earl, of course, runs a large athletic program at UCSD. He's done a remarkable job, and that's how we first met, becoming a D1 school in baseball and basketball now and other sports. I was a D1 athlete at Harvard, which doesn't really mean it's an NFL recruiting factory, anything but that. In fact, if we were televised at all during my day, it was on PBS. That gives you an idea of our program. But nonetheless, as athletes, we interacted, white, black, brown, all different races, as teammates. And that was a special bond. But even with that bond, we never really opened up the discussion internally on race and that open dialogue. And I think now in the 21st century, it's time. We've tried so hard for so long to create equality, education, job opportunity, diversity, and advancement. And we have succeeded in some regards. Just yesterday, it's a SpaceX launch, and the International Space Station, black astronaut comes out of the SpaceX module. I'm so proud, so excited to see that. I didn't expect that. But we have so far to go still. And obviously the events of the summer and the continuing events mean we need to have an open dialogue and try harder and take this as an opportunity for public service individually without office, simply to have a conversation. So I want to end there and offer the opportunity, Earl, to jump in and lead us down this path of open discussion.
Please, over to you, Earl.
So Jim, thank you for those opening comments. I will say that I think you started off with saying that Earl's the star and you're an actor. I'm going to dispute that and say that we're both stars in the sense of the idea that a black person and a white person can have a conversation, which is clearly one of the takeaways that we want from everyone, is a big part of what we're trying to do. You know, when we look at race, and when I look at how I got to the point of saying that it's time to have the conversation, because, as I said to one other group, let's think about a problem that any of us have been engaged in, knowing that it needed to be fixed, and you didn't talk about it. And that's what unfortunately has happened when it comes to racism in our society. So when Jim reached out to me and said he'd like to learn more and talk about it, to me, that's the epitome of where we'd like to get to as a society, where we develop this comfort level of talking about race. And for me, the impetus, and it kind of relates to one of Jim's stories about the black person that he worked with, the impetus for me was clearly the George Floyd murder. And I'm just going to walk through that a little bit because it's really poignant to why I've decided to talk about race in our society. But when I was watching George Floyd being murdered with the policeman with his knee on his neck, his hands in his pocket, other police officers standing around doing nothing, George crying out for his mother, that was a pivotal moment for me as a Black person where I just said, okay, that's it. I'm going to talk about it. I hope I can have others join in the conversation like Jim, because without having that conversation, we're not going to make any progress in really addressing racism in our society. That moment also caused me to reflect on some of my experiences as a Black American. I think it's important just to briefly touch on those so you have a better sense of what it means to be Black. One of the things that I have a fear of is being stopped by the police. It's a real fear. It's happened a couple of times. It's not only a fear for me, but it's a fear for my children as well. In fact, it's not uncommon in a Black family that you have a conversation about being stopped by the police because we know it's going to happen. And that conversation involves, at least for me, telling my children, if you're stopped by the police, put both hands on the steering wheel. When they ask questions, you respond, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. Don't make any sudden moves. If you have to move for something, articulate that before you do it, i.e., I'm reaching in the glove compartment for my registration. We have to have that conversation because as you've noticed over the last several months and years, that unfortunately many of us have been beaten or killed as a result. The other part, and Jim alluded to it already, was, moving into a neighborhood. And you wouldn't think that that's something you would have to do. But being a Black person, it's imperative that you do that. In fact, my wife and I, when we would go for a walk and all the neighbors are waving and hi Earl, she's wondering, well, how do you know all these? How do you know all these people? Well, I know these people because I made it a point so that I'm in a safe environment in my own neighborhood. Also, as a child, I recall having a conversation with a counselor, and I believe it was in high school, about my career thoughts or what I thought I'd want to be. I knew I wanted to do something in sports, whether it's a teacher, phys ed teacher, athletic director. I knew I wanted to be connected with sports because sports has been a outlet for me. It's been an avenue where racism and social injustice really isn't a part of that culture from the standpoint you work as a team, you have a common goal, and you know each other. So I know sports was a big part of what I wanted to do. When I mentioned that to the counselor, her response was, well, the best you should hope for is to be a mechanic. Not that it's disparaging to be a mechanic, but I realized, and my mother realized, that that was the aspirations or the things that she would say to Black students and not white students. When I was growing up, it was a clear understanding and a message from my parents that you have to be at least twice as good in everything that you do to potentially get the same opportunities that white people get because of the difference in the color of our skin. So those are things that I've experienced the N-word. I've experienced that from a child. I experienced it as an adult. I experienced it as a coach and an administrator. So all of those things, when I look back on it, it was clear to me that I need to do something. And we all need to do something when it comes to addressing racism. And for me, the choice was to talk about it and not just talk about it by myself, but I'm really happy and I feel privileged to have Jim willing to be a part of this conversation because it demonstrates that it can be done. And we'll talk about different ways throughout this conversation on how we can do that. So I also want to thank Heath for putting this or allowing us to have this platform. I also want to thank the people that are listening to this conversation because that's a sign that you want to do something as well, and I appreciate that. So Heath, that's my opening comments. Jim, I don't know if Jim looks like he wants to jump in there.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Jim.
There is so much to cover and so little time, but I have to say earlier, I had written an article acting on our principles. It was an opinion piece that was published in the La Jolla Light and some other local papers. And it really was an effort to express myself, to speak to the fact that we need to unite to act in some ways. And the question that I had was, well, how can we act? How can we be effective as an individual? Living in the bubbles that we all live in. And Earl, that's why I reached out to you, and it's very helpful. In the book, Race Talk, which you have prescribed to your student athletes and others within the university, it says that basically we can learn from strong and healthy people of color. And Earl, you're there and you provide that. You're open and you're comfortable. And we have to understand the differences of communication. So that's why I mentioned your leadership is really important in this, to have this comfort. Now, I reached out to Earl and had a very positive response and a welcoming embrace. I think it was through the telephone. But then, I also went out and, as I mentioned to you, Earl, before, I met a Navy SEAL, a commander, a retired commander, Navy SEAL black man. And I thought, wow, I want to have a conversation with him. And he wasn't quite as receptive, very surely a gentleman. And Earl, we tried to connect you and me and him, and that quite hasn't happened yet. But this can be difficult for white people. It's difficult, I think, maybe for black people. And Earl, would you comment on that?
No, there's no question it's difficult for blacks and whites. And I'm glad you brought that up because I do think that often when people talk about it being a difficult conversation, they're looking at it from the white perspective, but it's also difficult from a black perspective. Now, one of the things, quite frankly, for me, is that I feel very secure where I am in terms of, from a career perspective. I feel comfortable talking about race, but that's not true with many blacks, and particularly if you're not in a position of some stability from a work perspective, you can find yourself experience some repercussions for having that conversation. So you need to make sure before you do that people are willing to have it. It's one of the reasons why I require that my staff read the book Race Talk, so that there's some fundamental background that we're coming from versus just having what I consider a cold conversation when you really don't understand the circumstances. So
in our dialogue, Heath and Earl, and when I speak with Earl, you had mentioned that your student athletes of color are comfortable on the campus at UCSD, and then occasionally when they go into the community, they're not quite as comfortable. They don't feel quite as safe. And I think that's an interesting perspective. I read about some young students, high school students in Coronado. It was published in the Coronado Eagle, who attend Coronado High School and love it, have great friends. But sometimes when they go out in the community, as one said, when I walk in Vaughn's, I get looks and people sometimes even following. And maybe it's subconscious of others who do that, or maybe it's purposeful, I don't know. But tell us about that discomfort and dealing with that.
That's a discomfort that occurs frequently. I know for myself, going into different stores, and La Jolla would be in the mix, that there is a difference when you see people staring at you. I think the thing that's most disturbing, and this happens frequently, is if there's a security guard or a police officer at that particular venue. It's not uncommon to have that individual follow you as you maneuver throughout the store. So that's a microaggression, I guess, or macro, whichever one you want to use. But that's a common occurrence. And my students, and it's one reason why I wanted to talk to groups in La Jolla, because with UC San Diego being a part of the community, and for me to hear from my students, my scholar athletes, that they don't feel comfortable when they go into La Jolla because they've also been pulled over by the police. That's something that people in La Jolla should be aware of, and that's taking place, because that's another part that adds to the discomfort of being a person of color in La Jolla and in society as a whole. Heath?
So if I could, I'd like to pose a couple questions, the first of which refers back to Earl's comments about George Floyd's death. The Black Lives Matter movement that organized legal protests across the country in the wake of George Floyd's death has, in some cities, been plagued by violence, perpetrated in some cases by instigators outside the legitimate movement, and in some cases by police and federal intervention. In what ways do you think this is counterproductive to the discussion on race? And how can a continued and productive dialogue work past this? Earl?
Let me jump in there. So first, I want to share with the community and those people that are listening to this webinar. One of the co-founders for Black Lives Matter is a former student at UC San Diego, Alicia Garza, which I find that it's ironic that the Black Lives Movement, not ironic, but they've taken on a prominent role on addressing racism, and to discover that a student from UC San Diego is a co-founder, to me is just another reflection of the type of outstanding individuals that go through the UC San Diego education and what they do to contribute to society. So as far as the violence is concerned, none of us, myself included, would condone any type of violence, period. Violence is not the way to address the situation. I'm glad, Heath, that you mentioned that it's not uncommon with the violence, that it's not necessarily the protesters.
Mm-hmm.
It's not uncommon for it to be antagonistic individuals that are purposely causing violence, and they're doing that, in my view, and this is an important point for all of us, I think, throughout the night. The issue of the violence, which none of us condone, it's wrong and it shouldn't happen. What happens, though, and this is a big part when it comes to talking about race, too often the media or individuals want to focus and talk about the violence, which ends up being what I like to call a deflection from the real issue. And what needs to take place, yes, we should not condone violence, but we should recognize that that's not what the focus should be on. It should be on racism and how we can address it and have discussions about it. When I think about the protests that's occurring, and this is enlightening to me as a Black person, different from the protests that I saw or experienced prior to George Floyd's murder. When I look at the individuals that are engaged in the protests, in the past, it was predominantly people of color that were doing the protesting. I'm extremely happy to see, excited. I feel that there's real hope moving forward, because now when I've watched the protests, it's just the opposite, where the protesters are predominantly whites, and it's a diverse group that's demonstrating against racism. So while the violence occurs, it's counterproductive if we as a society, as individuals, choose to focus on the violence and not talk about the real issue, which is racism in our society. And there's a lot of deflections. I'm going to share some of those now because I think it's important to do so. So I put focusing on violence when the protest occurs as a deflection. I also consider things like all lives matters, blue lives matter. These are things that we see becoming prevalent during this time when we're trying to address racism. All lives matters, blue lives matters. We all agree that all lives matters, but turning it into an all lives matter conversation or a blue lives matter conversation is not addressing the real issue of Blacks being killed or beaten by police on a frequent basis. So we got to get away from that. That's another deflection, or in my view, counterproductive in the sense of it's taken away from the real conversation. So that's how I would look at addressing violence when it comes to protests. Jim?
Yeah, violence can't be condoned. It's not right. It's not right for the local community. It does distract. Of course it does. But I think we need to respond in a different way, or else I look at it with regard to the messaging. Words matter, Earl. We've talked a lot about this and how those words are selected and used. And the phrase defund police, I don't think has been productive either with regard to how it's interpreted by those who are from all different walks of life. So I think importantly, we need to clarify what the words mean, and that's the purpose of conversation, to have an understanding of what needs to be addressed going forward, what needs to be changed, and how we can provide solutions. And so what I'm worried about is that we've had this catharsis in the summer. We had street protests by the millions throughout the country. It was diverse in participation, which is a positive sign. Compare that to the Rodney King protests and riots in '85 after the Olympics. I worked on the LA Olympic Games. I remember how upbeat that city was and suddenly torn apart. So my question then is, how do we not respond with a collective shrug? And we've seen it all. The politicians and the leaders, they make the good proclamation. There is legislation passed. We think we do a check mark, solved, move on to the next issue, but it's not solved. So what I don't want to happen, and hopefully this is part of the continuation, is having these conversations. I don't want this to disappear in terms of its urgency and the need for individuals, not just to be unbiased, but to be anti-racist and take a more active stand as white people or Black people or any people of color. So my concern is that through the violence that we get distracted and we say, well, there we go again. We've seen this before, and we don't really get to the root cause. And so I think that really is a terrible consequence. But Earl, for us, how do we keep the momentum going and having a dialogue and having a conversation? It's much harder to dislike or even hate somebody if you know somebody, right?
Yeah,
and so that's my biggest concern.
Yeah, and it's a good. You mentioned a couple of things I want to address there. The first thing is words do matter, and the word defund as a word, I'll just be candid from my end. If you really look into, at least from the Black Lives Matters perspective, when they say defund, it's more realistically about reallocating funds, i.e., maybe having social workers within the police department, so when they're dealing with a situation that's clearly a mental illness case, which happens often, that you have someone that's trained to hopefully diffuse that situation. Reallocating funds differently as far as how training is being done with police, i.e. implicit bias training, i.e. reallocating funds to look at the hiring practices and profiles that are being used when policemen are being selected. So without question, words matter, and I'll be the first to say that defunding is not being interpreted the way it was meant to be from a Black Lives Matters perspective, which is really allocation. The second point, Jim, and I'm really glad you brought this up, because one of the things that I've been concerned about, and I'm going to make it a commitment on my end, and it has to be a commitment on everyone else that's listening or really wants to make a difference when it comes to addressing racism. And that is, we've got to get away from the past where situations would happen and it's a moment in time and you have the protest for a couple of days, weeks. You've got a lot of articles for a couple of days or weeks, and then it just disappears and we go back to the normal things that we do. So it's imperative for all of us, myself included, to be intentional and strategic for a long period of time so that it does result in change. And when I say change, it means change as to the way Black children are treated in school. And what I mean by that, it's very common when it comes to Black children in school that they're expelled or suspended from school for challenging behavior, and whites that demonstrate the same challenging behavior are not suspended from school. That's got to change. The idea, and we've talked about this already, the idea that Blacks are 2 to 3 times more likely to be pulled over by police, that's got to change. So we have to make a real commitment. And when I say commitment, the commitment needs to be within each of our spheres of influence. And I want this to be a clear takeaway. Within our spheres of influence, And when I say that, when I started to talk about racism and social injustice, initially I was focusing on the sports arena that I'm familiar with, because I know as an athletic director I have some influence. But when I really thought about it, all of us have much more of a sphere of influence than we realize. So whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's organizations that you work with or connected with, whether it's the workplace, whether it's the community, there's a lot of people that we all touch. And if we make a commitment to address racism when we see it, make a commitment to talk about it so that it becomes more comfortable and it becomes part of who we are, then we'll end up in a much better place. But it has to be a commitment. And in fact, someone shared with me a book. It's called Anti-Racism for a Baby. And throughout the book, it just talks about different conversations or things you would do to teach the child as he or she's growing up that what's right when it comes to treating all people as equals. So sustaining the conversation is key, and hopefully this is the beginning of that.
Hey, Earl, can we talk a bit about sports as a means to spark a dialogue? I served on sports teams. It's been a long time, but one of my teammates was a fellow, George Jackson, and he actually even accepted an award on my behalf because I wasn't available down in New York. George went on to be CEO of Motown Records and just a neat guy. We never talked about being Black. He was from Harlem. We never did. Again, we just felt that it wasn't appropriate. Could teammates, which is a special bond, be useful in sparking a dialogue, as a 19, 20, 21-year-old?
I'm sorry, I lost the. Can you just repeat? I lost that for
as an athletic director, can sports be used to foster more dialogue and conversation as opposed to a singular focus, maybe broader?
Yeah, no, actually, sports is a great way to have that conversation, and I'm glad that you brought it up. So one of the things within our athletic department, we've required that all of our teams throughout the year have conversations or do things that's focusing on social injustice or racism. And a number of the teams, which you would expect and understand, particularly from the coach's perspective, were uncomfortable and didn't know how to start that conversation. I told them that if you look at every sport, pretty much, there's a story about racism and how that's evolved within sports. So I think sport is a great way to start the conversation, whether it's the Jackie Robinson story, which a lot of people know about, whether it's the Arthur Ashe story with the tennis. I discovered through my coaches, which I wasn't aware of individuals or things that's occurred in the past regarding fencing and rowing. So sports to me is a great way to start the conversation because it's something that we're all connected to, and it's all part of our society, and there's much more of a comfort level. So I would say that sports is a great way to do that. I want to switch a little bit just to, as we were talking about racism in general, and one of the things we did in the athletic department, it's switching, but it's related, is that we were very much engaged in a voting initiative across the country and within our department. A lot of colleges were doing that. And for the Black community, that's something that we, to be honest, we haven't been engaged in at a level that we should be until this past election, where Blacks were a big part of the election process. But even within that context, and I just have to put it out there, even within that context, looking at what was attempted to occur in Michigan within the last couple of days, where individuals in Michigan that had the responsibility of certifying those votes were essentially trying to throw out or not certified votes in a Black community that was a big part of the election process, which is just another illustration of how deep racism is within our society. And fortunately enough people rose up and spoke against that. And they spoke against it, one, because it's just wrong not to count the votes, but there was clearly a racist focus on doing that. So the idea that if the votes ended up being certified, the idea that people spoke up and it was rectified is what we have to do more of moving forward when it comes to social injustice and racism in our society. So I just had to throw that in there because I felt it was necessary.
Yeah.
And Heath, may I comment one other time? I'm sorry if you have other questions maybe, but just this last one, I think it's interesting.
Absolutely.
Is that we think about this moment in time as sort of, broadly speaking, a collective effervescence, right? Where there's coming together of a collective view. I just have so much confidence in America's resiliency. And our ability to address problems openly, and obviously honoring our First Amendment rights of free speech and having open communication without having any part of it censored or restricted. So openness is so important to it. So I think about this opportunity in front of us, and I look at it as an opportunity for transformation. There's a wonderful movie, Heath and Earl, I just saw recently, it's a documentary called The Prison Within, and it's all about death row inmates at San Quentin of all mixed races, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, but who are given the opportunity through counseling and through mediation sessions as a group to talk through their existence, their issues, their crimes, and their aspirations. And it is transformative that's captured on this film. So I recommend it. It's hopeful. The hurt within to hurt others needs to be addressed. Racism needs to be addressed, but you do that often through talking it out and talking it through. And I think that's the purpose of this dialogue tonight. And hopefully we can spark people that are joining us tonight and others that are seeing this to take the initiative, because I think we all individually can make a difference, albeit it may be small, but small is good and small multiplies. And so I look at this and I encourage people to watch The Prison Within, or secondly, and Earl, I know you mentioned the race talk. I've got this one, I don't know if you can see it, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho. I'll put it over there, which is he takes a very honest approach. He says, listen, I'm going to make you uncomfortable in the next paragraph, but what do you think? And he's a Black man, but he had a very different existence. He grew up in a white middle-class suburb in Texas, was a star athlete, had lots of white friends, went to the University of Texas. He goes, for the first time I felt Black, but I wasn't totally Black and I wasn't totally white. So I had to rationalize that. So it was very interesting from his perspective.
So I'd like to take some of the threads of these conversations and tie them into the notion of systemic racism. And Earl's described some experiences and some perspectives that allude to that. And, systemic discrimination against Black people is pretty well documented now, especially as it's reflected in the criminal justice system with incarceration rates and violence by law enforcement officers against African American citizens. So how can this discussion on race become more inclusive and promote effective and positive solutions, transformative solutions that Jim alluded to the issues of systemic racism across all sectors of American society?
Well, I'll jump in, Earl, with one thought. I mean, legislatively, I think we can do a lot more than we've done. Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, proposed a bill. It matched about 80% of what the House had proposed and passed before a very contentious election cycle. And regrettably, it didn't get resolved in committee and never became law. It was something that needs to be reconciled in committee. That would address some of the issues you just mentioned, Heath. I think people are getting wise or understanding some of the systemic issues that we have. Again, we've had a great deal of systemic racism in our history. I think we've been chipping away at it, chipping away. We're looking for the grand slam, the home run, the Hail Mary touchdown that's going to solve everything. And I'm not sure that's possible unless we have this universal collective effervescence, or whatever you want to call it, this dialogue that continues. But it has to come from the people, right, that direct our leaders. And we need to be leaders ourselves without holding office to try to push forward on resolving this. So you're right about that. Incarceration is unbelievable. I mean, what, 13%, Earl, is a Black population in America? Maybe 60% or so, is that right? 60 in the prisons, yeah. So it's crazy. Yeah, something fundamentally is wrong there. We need to address right away. Yeah.
Earl, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have. There's a bunch of things here. First, and this is where some of the challenges, big challenges, comes in. First, we have to have people acknowledge that systemic racism exists. We have way too many people that don't want to believe that it exists. So that means you have to have the conversation. And I know it's difficult and it's uncomfortable. And I've been trying to think about ways that we can have these conversations to make it less uncomfortable. First of all, for most of us, you're not going to have a conversation with someone that you really don't know, right? I mean, I think that's something we can all agree with. But I've thought about this quite a bit. And I've created, for those of you that are here, you're hearing this is breaking news. I've just created what I'm calling the PAL rules of conversation. I like acronyms, okay? So here are the PAL rules. If I know Heath and we're going to have a conversation about race, the first thing I'll say is that personal attacks is unacceptable for this conversation. Personal attacks is unacceptable. I'm going to assume that whatever Heath says to me in our conversation, I'm going to assume good intent. That makes a big difference. Even if I disagree, I'm going to assume good intent. And by doing that, you get away from the emotion and the confrontation when you're being triggered, because we all are triggered with different things. And the L stands for be a good listener. Really listen during the conversation, because too often on both sides, somebody will say something that triggers, you want to jump in there and put your little 2 cents in, and you're not really listening to the individual to let him or her complete their thought. So that's my PAL rules, I think, to help with conversation. The other thing I would add to help with conversations is we need to move away from, and this goes back to what Jim said earlier, we need to, in terms of words matters, Okay? So the next thing we need to do, in my view, is to move away from calling someone a racist, which is probably similar to, as far as a person's feeling, similar to a black person being called the N-word. We need to move away from that approach to addressing the words. There's a difference. The words may be racist and not necessarily the individual. So I'll give you a good example, and I've done this in the past. But if I was to say, Heath, you throw the ball like a girl, an individual says to me, Earl, you're sexist because of that statement. I'm as far away from being sexist as you can imagine. But clearly the words were sexist, and I recognize that, and I adjust accordingly in conversation. So I think as far as having the dialogue, having the conversation, employing the power rules and looking at words and addressing the words, because quite frankly, a lot of things that occurs in those uncomfortable conversations is a result of what I call racial ignorance. It's not necessarily that the person is being hateful or racist. And I'm not trying to say that we don't live in a racist society, because we do, based on some of the things I just demonstrated. And this conversation about race, if there's ever been a time that it's imperative that we have this conversation, it's now. Not just because of what we saw and we continue to see with murders like George Floyd, but we all know, anyone that's awake or on this planet or in the US, the country is extremely divided now, extremely divided. I just did a little research last week, just out of curiosity. I Googled in the question of, has there been an increase in white supremacy groups in the United States? And what I found was that during the last 4 years, white supremacy groups have increased by 55%. That's where we are as a society and as a country. And if we don't recognize that, and if we don't talk about it, and getting back to what Jim said as far as legislation or laws, I want to add to that, people of influence, people that have power, if we can get them to use it to address racism and social injustice, we'll find ourselves in a much, much better place. So that's my response to that particular question. But we have to own up to the fact that we live in a racist society. It's systemic, and we need to do what we can to address that, and eventually get to the point where all people are treated with respect and dignity, regardless of the color of their skin.
That's right.
Okay. Let's go to questions from our audience. Meg, do we have questions audience members have sent in?
We sure do. Our first question is, today's New York Times reported on the Republican member of a key elections board in Michigan, Monica Palmer, who had made a motion to certify the results in the communities other than Detroit, a move that would effectively disenfranchise one of the nation's major predominantly Black cities. And can you comment on this and the fact that the Black vote is still at risk still in the past over the last 100 years?
Yeah, my comment really would be what I mentioned it a few minutes ago. It's just another example of racism in our society. And I followed it quite a bit on the news last night. First of all, it's even hard for me to fathom that an individual or individuals would want to discard any particular sections, groups, period. And the fact that it was a predominantly Black community is a clear statement of where the individual is, or was, or are, whatever proper English in this case is. It's just another example. And I believe I just said a little while ago, I'm really pleased that people rose up and spoke against it and got the votes to be counted because they spoke up. And that's the essence of what we're trying to accomplish with this conversation moving forward. Black votes have always been at risk. When you talk about voter suppression, and if you do any research on voter suppression and what that means, it's often targeted against the Black communities to make it very difficult. And I'll just share a very quick thing regarding voting and suppression. And this is way back when, but the effect is still the same when we look at some of the things that's happening now. Way back when I say way back when, I don't want to show my age, but as far as Blacks voting in the South, there was a time period where, as a Black, if you wanted to vote, one, you had to go further than the white counterparts. But part of the process, and this is a true story, of allowing them to vote was to look at this jar of marbles and guess how many marbles were in the jar. If you could do that, then you were allowed to vote. Now, obviously, that's on the extreme, but there's a lot of things similar to that that's currently happening to make it more difficult for Blacks to vote. So voter suppression is a big issue. It's still there, and that needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah, I would echo that, Earl. It's unacceptable to have any disenfranchisement of anybody, and the Black community in particular. I lived in China for 3 years. I ran a company there back in the early part of 2001 to 2003. And I tell you, they don't have the chance to vote, and we have that unique value here in America, and it needs to be protected and expanded. And I'm a technology entrepreneur. Heath mentioned that earlier. We have access to new technologies which should enhance and enfranchise people to vote regularly and easily. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm glad that we are standing up as a society against voter suppression and encouraging more active voting. It's what we need in this country, but we need that with good open communication too. And I think it's a great question in concert with what we're trying to achieve tonight in terms of an objective of open communication.
Thank you. Meg, other questions from the audience?
Yes, we do have a couple more. And I also want to just remind people that they can type in their question either into the chat box or the Q&A box. Our next question is, the election earlier this month clearly showed that Trump's 2016 election was not a fluke, and that there remains a strong conservative movement in American society, one that is hostile to multiculturalism. In what ways can we respond to this condition and its impact on racial equality?
Well, maybe that's a good one for me, Earl, since I'm the only conservative here, right? I'm not the only conservative here. Listen, we all have core American ideas of what makes this country great. Conservative values is not a pejorative term. Fiscal conservancy or other types of views. I don't subscribe to the fact that conservatives are biased or racially inept. I am not. I'm trying to learn and engage as a conservative. And there are other conservatives who are Black who are very active in the conservative movement. So I think the purpose of our discussion tonight is depoliticizing this topic, to open up honest and frank communication without recrimination. I think Earl speaks to that in terms of the PAL system he just articulated, and I subscribe to that as well. So, I would argue that we should have open eyes. Conservatives, liberals, progressives are not the cause of racism. Racism is something core to humanity that we need to address, and we should be able to with open communication and active engagement.
Earl, your thoughts?
Repeat the question one more time for me. Meg?
Yes, so, sorry. The election earlier this month clearly showed that Trump's 2016 election was not a fluke. There's a strong conservative movement in American society hostile to multiculturalism. And how can we respond to this and its impact on racial equality?
Well, the first thing, we've talked about conversation quite a bit, but the conversation is one thing, but who's directing the conversation is another. It is my hope that moving forward, the leadership of our country will talk more about us being united versus being divided. What we can do as far as the 70+ million that voted on the other side and that they're against multicultural society and things like that, I'm just shaking my head because I don't want to make it sound like I have an answer. I think the answer is that for those of us that know individuals that may be in that particular camp, or you think they're in that camp, to just start to have some dialogue and try to educate them on as much as possible that we're all one. As Martin Luther King once said, not only are we all one, but one day we should all be judged on the content of our character and not the color of our skin. So where we are right now, it's going to be a real challenge. That's the person that brought up the question. How do we change those individuals? But on the other hand, I'm extremely encouraged from the standpoint of, Jim and I have talked about our differences ideology-wise in terms of politics, but the bottom line is we both understand that we are Americans, we're all Americans, we're in this together. We want to make it truly a country that represents and cares about all individuals, and that's only going to occur by having more conversations, and hopefully the frenzy, the stirring up of racism will die down as a result of a different focus moving forward from the leadership, the important leadership of our country, and I think that'll be the way to move in a different direction. It's going to take time. There's no question about that. One of the things I'd like to focus on as an individual in terms of my character is the issue of patience. Patience is hard. Patience can be a lot slower than you want it to be. But I've also found that patience is a virtue. And I think if we look at it from that perspective, and we all really make a commitment to talk about it, I want to take it to the next step, do something about it, whatever that you can do, it'll ultimately get us to where we should be as a country.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to give both of you an opportunity for some final thoughts and comments. And I know, Earl, you wanted to talk about a couple of the books that you've been reading here. But let's start with Jim first. Final thoughts, Jim?
A final thought, Heath, and thank you again for all that participated tonight, and Heath for organizing and hosting us, and Earl for your openness and leadership on this topic. One that hasn't gone away in my lifetime, and we thought we had it solved in the 60s with the civil rights movement and all the efforts that we've put into that in education, and we still have a long ways to go. But again, I believe in Americans' resiliency and our ability to open communication. And that's the purpose here, is to have this dialogue. So speaking to my fellow white members of this communication tonight, it is hard to open up and say, hey, you know, I've been trained to be colorblind for my entire life. Now I want to engage an open Black conversation, an open conversation with a Black person, a woman, a man, and to have an open dialogue. Take that first step would be my final thought. Take the step, engage, even if you don't know someone well. I knew Earl, but I didn't know Earl on a daily basis.
Right.
I approached the other fellow, the Navy SEAL that I mentioned. I just met him. You know, you'll take some risks by doing that, but know that you're sincere, and I think they'll reflect that in their response. So try is my final thought. Engage, and let's keep the momentum going and opening the conversation up. Earl, the last word.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, I want to, Jim and I have talked about this, and Jim and I decided that if there's other groups or organizations that you would like us to talk to, similar dialogue, and we can talk about the format, we'd both be happy to do that, because I think that helps to start the conversations. So I'm going to give you, I want to leave it with about 7 or 8 recommendations that everyone should be able to do, or at least think about. And I've mentioned some of these, so I just want to reiterate it. The first one is, don't disregard the sphere of influence that you have, because it's much larger than you actually think. You just have to be intentional about it. Friends, family, organizations, community, workplace. There's a lot of individuals that we all engage with. So use that platform to talk about racism. The second one is to be a good listener when you're talking to a Black person about his or her experience. And I alluded to this earlier regarding conversation, but it's important that you listen and not feel compelled to jump in and say, you know, I've experienced discrimination myself, or, you know, I had something. You just listen to the experience and take that in, because it'll help you to understand what it is to be a Black person in America. Number 3 would be, and this one I deal with more often than you would think, but don't laugh at racist jokes. All that does is feed the racism that we're dealing with. What I do, and I'm not saying you should do this, but whenever I'm in an environment, if I hear a racist, sexist, homophobic joke, I just ask the individual, why did you say that? I'm not looking for a response. I'm basically telling the person, you need to think about what you say. Hopefully they'll become a little introspective as a result of asking, why did you say that? So don't laugh at racist jokes. Jim already mentioned this, and I smiled when he mentioned this, because it shows the evolution of the conversation. And the idea of saying that you don't see color or you're colorblind, that just really negates the fact that I am a Black person. It's almost like saying I'm invisible. It really points out the being afraid to talk about the differences, and we shouldn't be afraid to do that. The next thing I would say is that everyone should go through some type of implicit bias training. And it doesn't have to really be training in the formal sense. We are actually doing this with my staff in athletics through our HR department, but any of us can just Google implicit bias, and they'll provide you with some tests and things that you can do to see where your unconscious biases are, and recognize that all of us, even Earl W Edwards, all of us have biases. The key is to recognize those biases and be intentional in terms of how you're going to utilize that new knowledge in a positive way when it comes to implicit bias. The other thing is, and I'll try to wrap it up here, is don't deflect from the real issue of racism and social injustice. And I mentioned to focus on the violence, which we don't condone. That's a deflection. I'm also going to throw out there, and I think I said it earlier, saying things like all lives matter, blue lives matter. Clearly those do, but that's a deflection from the real issue. And that happens way too often. And last but not least, we have to move to conversation versus confrontation. And I think we can minimize the confrontation if you utilize the brand new rules that Earl bestowed upon you, the PAL rules. That'll help to move from confrontation to conversation. So thank you, Heath. Thank you, all the people that are part of this conversation. Thank you, Jim, for partnering up. And if you want to reach out to either one of us, I'm just going to give you my email address right now, which is Earl W Edwards at ucsd.edu. And that's the best way to reach me. And as I said, Jim and I this is just the beginning.
It's great, Earl. Great to be a partner with you. Heath, thank you. Mine's James Debello 80 at gmail.com. So appreciate any comments and any other opportunities, right, Earl, that we may have to speak about this. Thank you, Heath, again, for the La Jolla Historical Society.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you, gentlemen, both most sincerely for participating in this webinar and sharing your thoughts with us and your dialogue and pointing us in directions to help us understand different perspectives and nuances for engaging in talks about race. I also want to thank Meg Davis, who managed the technical aspects of the webinar tonight. And lastly, I want to thank all of the audience members who joined us for this program. We hope you found the discussion interesting and meaningful for your own perspectives of racial understanding. Thanks again to all of you, and have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.